Joseph Larros learned early how to keep his voice low and his movements measured. It was not taught to him directly, not by word or command, but by repetition, by correction, by the steady pressure of living in places where attention was a liability rather than a gift. By the time he reached manhood, restraint had become habit. It shaped the way he stood, the way he listened, the way he waited for others to speak before answering. It was not humility and it was not fear alone. It was adaptation. His earliest memories were of heat and salt, of wooden shutters rattling in the coastal wind, of mornings that began before sunrise when the air was still cool and the streets smelled of damp earth and coffee grounds. The house of his childhood stood not far from the harbor, solid but unadorned, its paint faded by sun and time. From the yard one could hear the sea, not as a roar but as a steady presence, a sound that never fully left, even in sleep. His father rose early and dressed with care, even after his military service had ended. The habit remained. His boots were kept clean. His shirts were pressed by hand. He spoke little at breakfast, reserving his words for matters he considered necessary. His mother filled the silence with small movements rather than speech, pouring coffee, slicing fruit, arranging plates. The household did not run on warmth or ease. It ran on order. Joseph was expected to observe before he acted. When he asked questions, they were answered carefully, sometimes deferred. Curiosity was encouraged but not indulged. There was always the understanding that the world beyond the house did not offer forgiveness freely, and that a child who learned discipline early might survive longer than one who did not. At the harbor he watched ships arrive and depart. He watched the laborers first, men with strong backs and tired eyes unloading crates and barrels under the sun. He watched the officers next, their posture upright, their hands clean. He noticed the difference long before he understood its meaning. Ships fascinated him not for their promise of escape but for their construction. He asked why iron floated. He asked how weight could be balanced against water. When he took apart broken clocks and tools, his mother did not stop him. She only insisted that he put them back together. When the decision was made to send him away, it was not framed as sacrifice. It was spoken of as necessity. Haiti, at that time, could offer him no future equal to his ability. His parents understood this plainly. They spoke of Europe not with reverence but with calculation. France was a place of education, not belonging. They did not pretend otherwise. The journey itself taught him patience. Weeks at sea did not invite conversation. He watched waves and sky, learning how time stretched when nothing demanded it. By the time he arrived, he had already begun to understand that endurance was not a single act but a long practice. France was colder than he expected, not only in weather. Streets were narrower than he imagined, buildings heavier, the air dense with smoke and stone. In the town where he studied, people noticed him immediately and then tried not to. Their eyes lingered and then looked away. Their politeness was careful, their distance precise. His room was small. It held a bed, a table, and a chair. The walls were bare. In winter, the cold seeped through everything. He learned to wake before dawn to study while his hands still functioned properly. He learned to keep his coat on indoors. He learned that hunger sharpened focus if it did not last too long. In the classroom, he spoke only when called upon. His answers were exact. His handwriting was clean. He did not afford his instructors any excuse to dismiss him. When others complained of difficulty, he listened and returned to his books. The work mattered more than recognition. Yet after graduation, the work no longer responded to effort. Doors closed without explanation. Letters went unanswered. Interviews ended politely and nowhere. He learned the sound of rejection without hearing the word itself. He learned how a man could be evaluated entirely before opening his mouth. The labor he found afterward required his body more than his mind. He accepted it without protest. Pride did not feed a family, and later it would not feed children. He rose early. He returned late. Each day followed the last with little variation. His life narrowed. Meeting Juliet did not alter the structure of his days at first. Their early conversations were brief and formal. She asked questions he was accustomed to deflecting, but her tone lacked examination. She listened without weighing his answers for advantage. Over time, this unsettled him more than hostility would have. Their marriage did not improve his standing, it reduced it. He felt it immediately in the way others addressed him or refused to. Their apartment was modest. The walls were thin. At night they spoke quietly so as not to be overheard. When their first child was born, the world did not soften. It pressed harder. By the time the second child arrived, illness followed closely behind. Medical care was expensive and impersonal. Doctors spoke to Juliet more than to him. He paid the bills and listened from the side. His days grew longer. His sleep grew shorter. The decision to leave France was not dramatic. It was made in stages, each one removing an alternative until only one remained. Haiti was spoken of as return rather than escape. His mother's letters were practical. There was work. There was space. There was family. When the tickets were purchased, Joseph did not celebrate. He counted days. He measured expenses. He considered weather and timing. He worried about Juliet's health and the children's strength. He did not speak of hope aloud. The train to the port was crowded. People talked of the ship they would board as if it were a certainty rather than a risk. Joseph listened without comment. He held his youngest child and kept the other close. The harbor smelled of oil and salt. The tender rocked slightly beneath their feet. When he first saw the great ship rising above the water, he felt no awe. He felt distance. Its size did not reassure him. It reminded him how small decisions were once they were placed into systems too large to answer to any single person. That first night aboard, their routine resumed quickly. They ate together. They returned to their cabin. The children slept. Juliet rested. Joseph stood by the porthole and watched the water move past, black and endless. Life aboard settled into quiet repetition. Meals arrived on time. Decks were walked at prescribed hours. Passengers passed one another with polite indifference. Joseph noticed who was welcomed and who was tolerated. He noted it without surprise. On the final morning, the sea was calm. The air was still. The ship moved forward without effort. Nothing suggested interruption. Joseph rose early. He stood on deck alone for a time. He thought of his mother's house. He thought of the harbor of his youth. He thought of work unfinished and work yet to begin. Nothing yet had broken. Nothing yet had announced itself as irreversible. But the balance he had learned to recognize, the one between weight and water, between order and failure, was already shifting, slowly and without sound. The first indication that the rules aboard the ship were not applied evenly came quietly and without announcement. There was no raised voice, no confrontation, no official notice posted on a wall. It appeared instead in small hesitations, in glances that lingered too long, in instructions that were delivered differently depending on who was listening. Joseph noticed it the morning after departure. He had risen early, as was his habit, careful not to wake Juliet or the children. The corridor outside their cabin was dim and still. The ship moved with a steady, almost imperceptible rhythm, a mechanical breathing that had already begun to feel permanent. He climbed the stairs toward the open deck, stepping aside for a steward who passed without acknowledgement. The air outside was sharp. The ocean stretched unbroken in every direction, its surface smooth enough to reflect the pale sky. Joseph rested his hands on the rail and stood quietly. Other passengers walked in pairs or small groups, wrapped in coats, speaking in low voices. No one addressed him, and he did not address anyone else. After a time, a steward approached and asked to see his ticket. The request itself was not unusual. What followed was. The steward examined the paper longer than necessary, holding it close to his face, then turning it slightly as though the light were poor. His expression remained neutral, but his posture was guarded. He asked where Joseph was staying. Joseph answered. The steward nodded and returned the ticket without apology or explanation. As the man walked away, Joseph remained where he was. He did not look after him. He did not move until the cold began to reach through his coat. Only then did he return below. At breakfast, a similar pattern repeated. The family entered the dining saloon together. They were shown to a table near the edge of the room, close to a service door. Other tables farther in remained unoccupied for some time. The waiter spoke to Juliet directly, his tone formal and courteous. When Joseph asked a question about the meal, the waiter answered briefly and turned away. No one said anything openly hostile. No one needed to. The children sensed the tension without understanding it. Simon became quieter. Louise clung to her mother more than usual. Juliet noticed and attempted to soften the atmosphere, speaking gently, smiling often. Joseph followed her lead. He had learned long ago that visible discomfort invited attention of the wrong kind. As the days passed, the pattern hardened. When passengers gathered on deck chairs in the afternoon, spaces around the Larrows family remained conspicuously empty longer than others. When the children laughed or cried, eyes turned quickly in their direction, then away. Conversations nearby lowered in volume. People adjusted their coats or changed position, as if proximity itself required justification. Joseph observed without reaction. He counted steps between decks. He memorized schedules. He learned which staircases were more crowded and which remained clear. He learned where he was likely to be questioned and where he was not. One afternoon, he attempted to enter a common room where several men were already seated, reading newspapers and speaking quietly. As he reached the doorway, an attendant stepped forward and informed him that the room was nearly full. Joseph looked past the man and saw empty chairs. He did not argue. He thanked the attendant and left. Later, Juliet asked him where he had been. He told her he had gone for a walk. That evening, during dinner, a woman at a nearby table asked another whether the children were adopted. The question was not directed at the Larrows family, but it was spoken clearly enough to be heard. The reply was a brief shrug. No further comment followed. Juliet stiffened. Joseph placed his hand lightly over hers. The gesture was small, deliberate. He did not want her to speak. He did not want her to draw attention. She understood and remained silent, though her jaw tightened and her eyes lowered to her plate. Afterward, in the cabin, she asked him whether he thought they should say something if it happened again. Joseph considered before answering. He chose his words carefully, as he always did. He said that the voyage was temporary. He said that arguments would not shorten it. He said that silence, while unpleasant, was safer than confrontation in a place where authority was distant and unaccountable. Juliet did not agree, but she accepted his reasoning. She had learned, through him, that injustice did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it preferred patience. On the third day, Joseph attended a brief gathering in a shared lounge, hoping to hear news of the ship's progress. A group of men stood near a table discussing speed and weather. When Joseph approached, the conversation slowed. One man glanced at him, then continued speaking, but his tone had changed. Technical terms were replaced with generalities. The discussion ended shortly afterward. No one asked Joseph his name. No one asked his profession. He returned to his cabin with a newspaper folded under his arm, unread. He sat on the bed and listened to the muted sounds of the ship around him. Juliet was braiding Simon's hair. Louise slept fitfully in her crib, her breathing uneven. Joseph felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation he had come to associate with constraint rather than fear. It was the knowledge that his presence altered the environment, that his mere existence introduced discomfort others felt entitled to resolve by excluding him. Later that day, an announcement was made regarding scheduled activities. The voice was calm and authoritative. It outlined times and locations, welcoming all second-class passengers. Joseph attended one such activity with Juliet and the children. They arrived on time. The room was already half full. The attendant hesitated, then gestured toward the back. During the program, Joseph noticed that questions from the audience were answered selectively. When he raised his hand, it was not acknowledged. When Juliet raised hers moments later, it was. She did not ask a question. She only thanked the speaker. The acknowledgement was brief, but it occurred. The distinction was clear. That night, as the children slept, Juliet spoke quietly. She said she felt as though they were being watched. Joseph said that they were. He said it was better to assume observation than to be surprised by it. Neither of them slept well. On the morning of the final day, Joseph attended the church service held in the dining saloon. He sat near the back with his family. The words spoken were general, intended to comfort rather than instruct. Joseph listened without resistance. He was accustomed to messages that promised order while avoiding responsibility. As the congregation dispersed, a man brushed past him deliberately, shoulder to shoulder. There was no apology. Joseph steadied himself and remained where he was. Juliet turned sharply, but the man had already moved on. That afternoon, Joseph went alone to the smoking room. The space was enclosed, warm, heavy with the smell of tobacco and polished wood. Men sat at tables, cards and glasses arranged with care. Conversations were subdued but relaxed. Joseph took a seat at the edge and ordered a drink. No one objected openly. No one welcomed him. As he sat, he felt the shift in attention. Not hostility, but calculation. He was being assessed not as an individual, but as a presence that disrupted and assumed uniformity. He drank slowly, keeping his posture composed. At one point, a man across the room laughed and made a remark about regulations, about keeping order when emergencies arose. The comment was vague, but the laughter that followed was sharp. Joseph did not look up. He finished his drink and left. By evening, the ship had grown colder. The air carried a sharper edge. The sea remained calm, deceptive in its stillness. The Larose family ate dinner together. Joseph spoke little. Juliet watched him closely. When they returned to their cabin, Joseph prepared for sleep but did not lie down immediately. He stood for a time by the door, listening to footsteps in the corridor, to voices passing and fading. The signs were not dramatic. They did not demand immediate action, but they accumulated, pressing inward, narrowing the margins within which safety could be assumed. Joseph understood systems. He understood how authority behaved when tested, how rules could bend without breaking, how discretion could become a weapon without being named as such. As the lights dimmed and the ship continued forward into the dark, he felt the quiet certainty that whatever would happen next, it would not unfold evenly for everyone aboard. He did not speak this aloud. He did not need to. By the fourth day at sea, routine had become rigid rather than comforting. What had first appeared as order now revealed itself as control, maintained not by force but by expectation. Passengers learned where to stand, when to speak, how long to linger. The ship did not need to announce its authority. It exercised it through repetition. Joseph felt this most clearly in the narrowing of choices. He could still walk the decks, but only at certain hours without attracting attention. He could still attend meals, but always from the same table, always under the same quiet observation. He could still move freely through second-class areas, but the freedom carried an invisible boundary that followed him closely. On the morning of the 14th of April, the air was noticeably colder. The sea remained calm, but the temperature had dropped enough that breath lingered briefly before fatting. Joseph wrapped his coat tightly and walked the deck as he had each morning. This time, he did not stay long. A group of passengers stood near the rail ahead, speaking in hushed tones. As Joseph approached, their conversation paused. One of them glanced back, then shifted position, subtly blocking the narrow path between deck chairs. Joseph stopped. He waited. No one moved. After a moment, he turned and walked the other way. This was not an accident. He understood that. It was not a single person's action, but a shared understanding, carried silently between strangers. He was not welcome in that space at that time. The rule had not been written, but it had been enforced. When he returned to the cabin, Juliet noticed his expression. She asked whether something had happened. Joseph said no. He sat and adjusted his shoes, his movements careful and precise. He did not want the children to sense his frustration. Simon was restless that morning. She asked repeatedly when they would arrive. Juliet answered patiently each time, explaining that travel took time, that the sea could not be rushed. Louise coughed lightly and pressed her face into her mother's coat. Juliet watched her closely, concern etched into every small movement of her hands. Joseph gathered their things for breakfast. He checked that the children's coats were properly fastened, that Juliet's scarf covered her neck. These preparations were not simply against cold. They were a form of readiness he could not name aloud. In the dining saloon, the atmosphere had shifted again. Conversation was louder, edged with nervous humor. Talk of ice drifted from table to table, half serious, half dismissive. Some men spoke confidently of the ship's strength. Others joked about exaggerated warnings from wireless operators. Joseph listened but did not participate. He noticed that when he looked toward a speaker, the man often looked away. When Juliet addressed him directly, others listened. After the meal, an announcement was made regarding deck access. Certain areas were to be restricted temporarily, though no explanation was offered. Passengers complied without complaint. The ship did not invite questions. Joseph felt the pressure tighten. He spent the late morning inside with the children, reading to Simon while Juliet rested. Louise slept fitfully, her small body warm against Joseph's chest. He held her carefully, conscious of her breathing, of the fragility that made every decision feel weighted. Holding her, he thought again of Haiti, of space, of air that did not carry suspicion, of streets where his presence did not require explanation. The memory did not comfort him as much as it once had. Distance had altered it. In the afternoon, Juliet insisted he take a break. She urged him to go for a short walk to clear his head. Reluctantly, he agreed. The smoking room was quieter than before. Fewer men were present. The mood had changed. Laughter came less easily. Cards were dealt and redealt without enthusiasm. Joseph took his usual seat near the wall. He ordered a drink. The waiter hesitated, then complied. A conversation near the center of the room turned toward emergency procedures. One man spoke confidently about lifeboats, about drills that had been conducted earlier in the voyage. Another countered that no full drill had taken place, that too much confidence had been placed in design rather than preparation. Joseph listened closely. A third man remarked that in any case order would be maintained. He spoke of discipline, of rules that existed for a reason. He mentioned women and children, the natural hierarchy of survival. The others nodded. Joseph noticed the way the man's gaze flicked toward him briefly before returning to the group. The look was not accusatory, it was anticipatory. Joseph finished his drink and stood. As he left the room, the conversation resumed at full volume. The remainder of the afternoon passed slowly. The children grew tired. Juliet's movements were deliberate, her pregnancy making even small tasks require effort. Joseph helped where he could, keeping his voice calm, his demeanor steady. As evening approached, the temperature dropped further. Stewards moved through corridors with increased urgency, though their expressions remained composed. Doors were checked. Instructions were repeated. The ship felt alert in a way it had not before. Dinner that night was quieter. The menu was the same, the service precise, but conversation was subdued. Simon ate less than usual. Louise refused food altogether. Juliet watched Joseph as he ate, noticing the way he paused between bites, listening. At a nearby table, a man laughed too loudly at a remark about unsinkable ships. The sound rang briefly, then fell flat. No one joined in. After the meal, Juliet suggested returning to the cabin early. Joseph agreed. He carried Louise, feeling the small weight of her body, the steady rhythm of her breathing. Simon walked close, holding her mother's hand tightly. In the corridor, a steward passed them and paused. He looked at Joseph, then at Juliet, then at the children. He said nothing, but his expression hardened slightly before he continued on his way. Joseph closed the cabin door carefully behind them. Inside, the room felt smaller than before. The porthole showed only darkness now. The sea was invisible, its presence suggested only by the vibration beneath their feet. Juliet helped the children change for bed. Joseph folded their clothes neatly, placing them in the small trunk at the foot of the bed. These actions, ordinary and repetitive, grounded him. He focused on each movement, refusing to let his thoughts run ahead. When the children were asleep, Juliet sat on the bed and exhaled slowly. She said she felt uneasy. She said the ship felt different. Joseph sat beside her. He chose his words carefully. He said that large systems often resisted acknowledging risk. He said that confidence was sometimes mistaken for safety. He said that if anything were to happen, they should stay together and follow instructions, but also trust their judgment. Juliet listened without interruption. Before lying down, Joseph checked the life jackets stored in the cabin. He did not remove them. He only made sure they were within reach. When he finally lay beside Juliet, sleep did not come easily. The ship continued forward, its engine steady, its course unchanged. Outside, ice lay scattered across the dark water, unseen by most, irrelevant to those who believed in certainty. Joseph stared into the darkness, aware of the pressure building around them, tightening not with sound or motion but with expectation. He knew that when strain finally revealed itself, it would do so unevenly. He did not know how soon that moment would arrive. But he was certain it would not grant mercy equally. The moment did not arrive with drama. It arrived with interruption. Joseph had just risen from the narrow bed when the ship shuddered beneath him. It was not violent. There was no crash that threw him against the wall, no sudden scream of tearing metal. Instead, it felt like a hesitation, as if the vessel itself had paused mid-thought. A faint vibration passed through the floor, followed by a soft grinding sound that lasted only seconds. Juliet sat upright immediately. "What was that?" she asked. Joseph did not answer at once. He stood still, listening. The engines had stopped. That absence, more than the sensation itself, unsettled him. Machines of this scale did not fall silent without cause. In the corridor outside, footsteps sounded, then voices. Someone laughed low and uncertain. Another voice answered with reassurance, practiced and thin. Joseph reached for his coat. He opened the cabin door and stepped into the hallway. A steward stood several doors down, speaking calmly to a small group of passengers who had emerged in their night clothes. The steward's posture was composed, but his eyes moved too quickly. Joseph approached and asked what had occurred. The steward looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. Then he said the ship had brushed ice, nothing more. He said there was no danger. He said passengers should return to their cabins and wait. Joseph asked whether the engines would resume. The steward did not answer directly. He repeated that there was no danger. Joseph returned to the cabin. Juliet was already dressing, her movements controlled but urgent. She did not ask further questions. She had heard enough in Joseph's silence. Simon had woken and was crying softly. Louise stirred, coughing once, then settling again. Joseph took the life jackets from their place near the wall. Juliet paused when she saw them. "Are we supposed to?" she began. "Yes," Joseph said quietly. "Put them on the children." He helped her fasten the straps, his fingers unsteady despite years of mechanical training. The jackets were stiff, awkward, clearly designed without children in mind. Simon protested, frightened by the unfamiliar weight. Louise whimpered, clinging to Joseph's coat. When they were ready, Joseph opened the door again. The corridor had filled. Passengers stood in clusters, some fully dressed, others half asleep, all speaking at once. Stewards moved through the crowd repeating instructions. Their voices were calm. Their faces were not. Joseph guided his family toward the stairwell. Progress was slow. The ship felt different now, its balance altered subtly but unmistakably. He could feel the incline underfoot, slight but persistent. As they climbed, a man brushed past them, muttering something under his breath. Joseph did not respond. His attention remained fixed on keeping Juliet steady, on keeping the children close. When they reached the upper deck, the cold struck immediately. The air cut through clothing and skin, sharp and unforgiving. Stars burned overhead, indifferent and bright. The sea below was black and still, broken only by scattered fragments of ice floating past the hull. The deck was already crowded. Officers shouted instructions. Lifeboats hung suspended, some already being lowered. Crew members worked the ropes with hurried precision. Women cried out for husbands. Children clung to coats and skirts. The order promised by procedure struggled against the weight of panic. Joseph scanned the scene quickly. He saw at once that time was limited. The ship's angle was more pronounced now. The bow dipped lower with each passing minute. Water could be heard rushing below, a sound that carried through the deck like breath through a wound. Joseph moved toward the nearest lifeboat. An officer stood beside it, calling for women and children. His voice was firm, edged with authority. He waved women forward, gesturing sharply. Juliet hesitated. She looked at Joseph, her eyes wide, searching his face for certainty. Joseph nodded. "This one," he said, "go now." She shook her head, instinctive refusal tightening her grip on his arm. "We'll find another," she said, "together." Joseph placed his hand over hers and pressed gently. "There may not be another," he said. "Take the children." The officer called again. Juliet's resistance broke into tears. She bent to lift Simon, her hands shaking. Joseph lifted Louise, holding her close for a final moment. He felt the warmth of her through the jacket, the small rise and fall of her chest. He handed her to Juliet. The lifeboat shifted suddenly as weight was added too quickly. A crewman shouted. The rope strained. For a moment, everything froze. Then the boat began to descend. Juliet screamed. Louise was no longer in her arms. Joseph realized at once what had happened. In the confusion, in the crush of bodies and movement, the child had been passed back toward him, or he had never fully released her. The moment stretched unbearably long as the lifeboat dropped, separating mother from child. Joseph pushed forward instinctively. A crewman stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "No men," the man shouted. "Stand back." Joseph tried to explain. He pointed. He spoke quickly, clearly, naming Juliet, naming Louise. He said the child's mother was in the boat. He said he only needed to pass her down. The crewman did not listen. His eyes fixed on Joseph's jacket, on his face, on the fact of his body moving forward against instruction. To him, Joseph was not a father completing a separation. He was a man attempting to breach order. The lifeboat descended further. Juliet reached upward, her arms extended, her voice raw with terror. Joseph knew then that no appeal would succeed. He turned sharply to the side. A woman stood nearby, frozen, her face pale, her hands empty. Joseph placed Louise into her arms without asking. He spoke quickly, urgently, his voice low but forceful. "Give her to the woman in the boat," he said. "That is her mother." The woman hesitated only a moment, then she nodded. What followed happened in fragments. Hands reached out. The child passed from one stranger to another, lowered carefully, then urgently. A chain formed without instruction, without authority, bound only by recognition of need. Juliet received Louise and collapsed against the side of the boat, clutching her to her chest. The lifeboat continued downward. Joseph stood back as the crewman released the rope. He watched the boat hit the water, watched it pull away from the ship, watched his family recede into the darkness. Juliet looked back once. Joseph raised his hand. He did not call out. His voice would not have reached her. He held his posture steady, forcing his face into calm. The lifeboat disappeared among others, drifting across the black surface. Joseph remained where he was. Around him, the deck grew more chaotic. Shots rang out, sharp and sudden, fired into the air to enforce compliance. Men argued with officers. Some attempted to rush boats and were beaten back. Others stood apart, silent, resigned. The ship's angle increased. It was no longer possible to ignore. Joseph turned away from the rail. He did not run. There was nowhere left to go. He walked instead, moving carefully across the slanted deck, past people who did not see him, past those who did and looked away. He descended toward the interior of the ship, toward spaces already abandoned. The smoking room was nearly empty when he reached it. A few men sat at tables, drinks in front of them, hands steady. No one spoke. Cards lay untouched. Joseph took a seat. He removed his coat and folded it across his knees. He rested his hands on top of it, palms down. The ship groaned around them, metal protesting under strain. Somewhere deep below, water surged unchecked. Joseph closed his eyes. The line had been crossed, not by the ice, not even by the sinking itself, but by the moment when order had chosen efficiency over justice, when authority had mistaken threat for difference. He had obeyed every rule. He had waited his turn. He had accepted exclusion without resistance. And still, in the instant that mattered most, he had been seen not as a father, but as an obstacle. The lights flickered. Someone began to pray softly. Joseph remained silent, listening as the world he had navigated so carefully finally, irrevocably, gave way. The room settled into a strange stillness after the initial surge of noise passed. The smoking room no longer carried conversation, only presence. The men inside did not speak to one another. They did not need to. Each understood in his own way that whatever remained to be done would not involve negotiation. Joseph sat upright, his back straight, his feet planted firmly on the floor. The table before him bore a thin ring where his glass had rested earlier. He had not ordered another. His throat was dry, but thirst had become irrelevant. Around him, the ship continued to change. The angle increased incrementally, not enough to force movement, but enough to require attention. Chairs shifted slightly. A glass tipped and rolled before shattering softly against the wall. No one reacted. In the quiet, Joseph's thoughts returned not to the moment on deck, but to everything that had led to it. He did not replay the separation itself. That image had already fixed itself beyond alteration. Instead, he recalled smaller things, details he had stored unconsciously for years. A look held too long, a question left unanswered, a rule applied selectively. He understood now that the disaster had not begun with the iceberg. It had begun earlier, in the assumption that some bodies required management while others required protection, in the belief that order could be preserved by narrowing compassion, in the habit of mistaking silence for consent. Joseph had resisted quietly all his life, not with banners or raised voices, but with precision, with excellence that could not be dismissed without effort, with endurance that refused collapse. Even now, seated in a sinking ship, he resisted in the only way left to him. He remembered. He remembered the steward who had examined his ticket too carefully. He remembered the attendant who had denied him entry to an empty room. He remembered the crewman who had blocked his path without hearing his words. These moments, insignificant on their own, formed a record. He held them deliberately, as one might hold tools laid out in sequence. The ship lurched slightly. One of the men across the room braced himself against the table. Water could be heard more clearly now, a persistent rush echoing through the corridors beyond the walls. The sound did not rise and fall. It advanced steadily, indifferent to resistance. Joseph stood. He did not know why he moved toward the writing desk in the corner of the room. Perhaps it was habit. Perhaps it was instinct. The desk was small, bolted to the floor. A ledger lay open, its pages blank beyond a few official entries made earlier in the voyage. He sat and took the pencil resting beside it. For a moment he hesitated. What he wrote would not save him. It would not alter the ship's descent or summon rescue. He understood this clearly. But writing had always been his way of imposing order where none was offered. It was a form of refusal, a declaration that his experience would not vanish entirely into silence. He began slowly. He did not dramatize. He did not embellish. He wrote names where he could. He wrote times as best he could estimate them. He described actions, not emotions. He noted the separation on deck, the obstruction, the child passed hand to hand. He did not accuse directly. He did not need to. The facts, arranged carefully, were sufficient. The pencil scratched softly against the paper, nearly lost beneath the groan of the ship. His handwriting remained steady. Years of technical drawing had trained his hand to remain precise under pressure. As he wrote, the room tilted further. He adjusted his position, bracing one foot against the desk's leg. Water began to seep in along the floor from the corridor beyond, thin and dark. One of the men rose and moved toward the exit. He did not speak. He did not return. Joseph continued. He wrote of Juliet and the children only briefly, identifying them by name and relation. He did not describe their faces. He did not record his feelings. He wrote instead of intention, of purpose, of the decision to send them away because survival demanded it. When he finished, he closed the ledger carefully. He considered tearing the page free but decided against it. A loose page might be lost. Bound paper had a better chance of remaining intact, even if the ship did not. He placed the pencil beside the book and stood again. The water was ankle-deep now, cold and numbing. It moved with purpose, carrying small debris with it, fragments of a place that had once promised safety. Joseph walked to the wall and rested his hand against it, steadying himself. He did not shout. He did not seek another lifeboat. He knew the time for that had passed. What remained was witness. He moved back toward the door and looked once more into the corridor. It was empty now, the lights dim and flickering. The water advanced unchallenged. Joseph returned to the center of the room and sat again, this time without the desk between him and the floor. The chair slid slightly as the angle increased. He adjusted and remained still. In his mind he spoke to Juliet without words. He did not offer comfort or apology. He offered clarity. He hoped that, in time, she would understand that his final act had not been surrender but preservation, that he had done what he could with what had been allowed to him. The ship gave a long, resonant groan, deeper than any before it. The lights went out entirely. In the darkness, the water reached his knees. Joseph did not move. He remained present, attentive, until the cold forced breath from his lungs, and the room ceased to exist as a place at all. What he left behind was not a protest shouted into chaos, but a record set quietly against erasure. The morning light did not reach the water evenly. When the rescue ship arrived, it did so into a field of debris and silence that resisted interpretation. Lifeboats drifted at irregular distances, their occupants stiff with cold and shock. Bodies floated among splintered wood and personal effects, unclaimed and unnamed. Order returned quickly, but selectively. The rescue proceeded according to procedure. Names were taken, numbers were counted, survivors were wrapped in blankets and directed to assigned spaces. Officers spoke in measured tones, offering reassurance that felt rehearsed rather than earned. The ship moved on schedule once the last lifeboat was accounted for. From the beginning, the record favored efficiency over completeness. Juliet sat with her daughters pressed against her, her body curved inward protectively. She answered questions when asked, her voice quiet, controlled. She gave her husband's name clearly, repeating it when it was misspelled or misheard. She described him carefully, providing details that might distinguish him from the many others unaccounted for. Each time she received the same response. He had not been seen. He was likely lost. There was no further action to be taken. The officers did not speak unkindly. Their faces carried sympathy, but sympathy was not investigation. It was not correction. It was not effort. Once the initial list was compiled, once categories were established, deviations became inconveniences. Joseph's name did not fit easily. He was second class, but his profession did not align with expectations. He was married to a woman whose appearance invited different assumptions. His children did not resemble the neat classifications the clerks relied upon. When asked to describe him, Juliet spoke with precision, but the descriptions blurred in the hands of those recording them. Ink ran, paper shifted, names settled where they could. When the ship docked, the crowd waiting on the pier surged forward. Reporters shouted questions. Officials called names. Families searched faces with desperate intensity. Juliet moved through it all quietly, scanning each group of men brought forward. Joseph was not among them. She approached officials again. She asked whether additional survivors might be found, whether other rescue ships were searching, whether bodies would be recovered. She was told that patrols were underway. She was told that the sea was vast. She was told that recovery was uncertain. Her husband's absence was treated as expected. In the days that followed, formal inquiries began. Committees convened. Testimonies were gathered. Attention focused on engineering decisions, on speed, on weather reports, on chains of command. The narrative that emerged required simplification. It required heroes and errors, not complications. When Juliet attempted to submit her account, she was heard politely and recorded briefly. The emphasis remained on the ship, not the people obstructed by it. She described the moment on deck. She spoke of the crewmen who blocked Joseph's path. She spoke of the confusion, of the delay, of the necessity that forced a stranger to intervene. The response was measured. Procedures had been followed. Officers had acted under pressure. Mistakes, if any, were unavoidable. No names were requested. No follow-up occurred. Joseph's final actions did not appear in any official report. The ledger he had written in remained sealed within the wreck, inaccessible and unreferenced. His presence aboard the ship was acknowledged only as a line item, easily overlooked among hundreds of others. As the weeks passed, public attention shifted. Newspapers printed lists of the dead and the saved, but space was limited. Editorial decisions favored prominence. Stories that complicated the image of order under pressure were minimized. Juliet received charitable assistance. Committees provided clothing, temporary lodging, financial aid. These gestures were generous, but they were also final. Once given, they concluded the obligation. She was advised not to dwell on unanswered questions. She was advised to accept loss as inevitable. When she insisted that her husband's separation had not been inevitable, that it had been enforced, her words were met with discomfort. Officials avoided her gaze. Conversations ended sooner. It became clear that persistence would not alter the outcome. The system had already moved on. Joseph's absence became an administrative certainty rather than a moral question. In France, notices arrived months later. Condolences were formal. Details were sparse. The event was described as tragic, unavoidable, beyond individual accountability. No reference was made to the moments that had shaped the outcome. Juliet read the letters carefully. She folded them and stored them away. She did not respond. The institutions responsible for recording history had closed their books. What remained was silence, reinforced by procedure, sustained by convenience, and accepted by those who benefited from its simplicity. Joseph Larrows became, officially, one of many. Unofficially, he became nothing at all. Time did not loosen the silence immediately. It thickened it. Years passed in which Joseph's name was spoken only within the walls of one household. Outside those rooms, the disaster hardened into a fixed account, repeated so often that deviation came to be treated as error rather than correction. The ship had sunk. Men had died. Women and children had survived. Procedures had failed in places and succeeded in others. The story became stable enough to be taught. Stability did not require completeness. Juliette returned to France with her daughters and later gave birth to her son. Life narrowed around necessity. Work replaced grief where it could. Routine filled the hours left vacant by loss. There was no public place for memory. What she carried could not be shared without cost, and so it remained private. She told the children what they needed to know when they were old enough to ask. She did not embellish. She did not soften the truth. She spoke of their father as he had lived, not as he had died. She spoke of his patience, his restraint, his insistence on dignity even when dignity was inconvenient. Simon remembered fragments, cold air, a crowd, her father's hand lifting her. Louise remembered nothing directly. Her knowledge came second-hand, filtered through repetition and silence. Joseph Jr. grew up with absence as fact rather than event. His father existed as a photograph, a name, a presence inferred rather than recalled. As decades passed, the world changed in ways that made older silences less secure. Records were revisited. Marginal notes gained attention. Questions that had once been dismissed as disruptive were asked again, this time with distance. It was not the institutions that reopened the case. It was individuals. Researchers began to notice inconsistencies in passenger lists, names that appeared in one ledger but not another, occupations that did not align with class assignments. A black man listed without commentary, as if his presence required no explanation, when in truth it contradicted every assumption of the era. At first, the inquiries went nowhere. Archives yielded nothing conclusive. Official reports remained unchanged. But absence itself became notable. The lack of detail where detail should have existed raised questions. Louise was an old woman by the time she was contacted. She lived quietly, her apartment modest and orderly. Photographs lined the walls, arranged not for display but for continuity. When the letter arrived requesting an interview, she did not respond immediately. She read it several times, then placed it aside. Silence had protected her for most of her life. It had allowed her to function, to work, to endure. Breaking it meant reopening rooms long sealed. She agreed only after careful thought. The interview did not take place in public. There were no cameras at first, only notebooks and a tape recorder placed respectfully on the table. The questions were deliberate, cautious. The interviewer did not rush. Louise spoke slowly. She corrected names. She clarified dates. She described her father not as a symbol but as a person. She recounted the decision to change ships, the reasoning behind it, the importance of remaining together as a family. She described the night of the sinking as it had been told to her, repeated over years until it had become precise through consistency rather than memory. When she reached the moment on deck, she stopped briefly. Then she continued. She spoke of the separation, of the obstruction, of the refusal to listen. She did not accuse, she described. The interviewer asked whether she believed race had played a role. Louise answered carefully. She said that if her father had been heard, the outcome might have differed. She said that he had followed every instruction given to him. She said that he had not attempted to save himself. She said that he had been prevented from completing the act required of him because he was seen first as a threat rather than as a father. The interviewer did not interrupt. Over several sessions, the account expanded. Letters were produced. A photograph was examined. Names once misspelled were corrected. Context was restored. When the story was finally written, it did not appear as revelation. It appeared as correction. Public response was muted at first. The narrative did not fit established frameworks. It offered no heroism. It offered no comfort. It described injustice without spectacle. But it endured. Museums amended exhibits quietly. Academic papers cited the account cautiously, then with increasing confidence. A name began to appear where none had been before. Joseph Larrows was no longer absent. The truth did not surface with ceremony. It emerged gradually, as truths often do, when the cost of denial finally outweighed the effort of acknowledgement. By the time recognition arrived, Louise had already lived most of her life. She did not seek vindication. She sought accuracy. She had broken the silence not to accuse, but to prevent disappearance. In that she succeeded. The acknowledgement did not change the past. It did not restore what had been taken or correct the moment when intervention had failed. It arrived too late to offer relief to those most affected. But it altered the record, and that alteration carried its own weight. Joseph Larrows's name entered lists that had long been considered complete. It appeared in museum captions and archival annotations, often without elaboration. There was no sudden elevation of his story. It was inserted quietly, almost cautiously, as if history itself were uncertain how to receive it. The adjustment unsettled some. There were those who questioned the relevance of revisiting individual experiences so long after the event. They argued that tragedy did not discriminate, that loss had been widespread, that focusing on difference risked distorting a shared calamity. These objections were framed as concern for unity rather than resistance to truth. They did not prevail. What endured was not argument but accumulation. Each retelling added context. Each citation strengthened credibility. The story did not require advocacy. It required only space. In classrooms, it was sometimes mentioned as an aside. A footnote expanded. A lecture paused briefly to acknowledge complexity. Students asked questions that had not been asked before, not out of outrage but curiosity. Joseph's life was no longer reduced to his death. He was recognized as a man who had trained for a profession he was not permitted to practice, as a husband who had crossed boundaries others enforced but did not question, as a father who had made a decision under constraint within a system that limited his choices. Juliet did not live to see this correction. Her silence remained intact until the end. It had not been weakness. It had been survival. She had chosen preservation of her children over confrontation with institutions that had already demonstrated indifference. Her children carried the outcome differently. Simon, who remembered the night in fragments, had lived with unease rather than clarity. Louise, who had spoken at the end of her life, had transformed inherited memory into record. Joseph Jr., who had never known his father, had lived under the weight of a name that finally received explanation. None of them sought recognition. They sought accuracy. The aftermath did not produce closure. It produced alignment. The record now matched the reality they had always known. Joseph's final actions remained largely undocumented in official terms. The ledger he wrote was never recovered. The words he set down went to the sea with him, but absence itself became evidence. The gap in documentation spoke to the conditions that had created it. What survived was not the image of a man standing against catastrophe, but of a man navigating constraint with discipline until the end. His resistance was not defiance. It was insistence on humanity within a structure that had denied it. History did not redeem him. It acknowledged him. That acknowledgement did not echo loudly. It settled instead, becoming part of the broader understanding of how injustice operates without declaration, how systems fail not only through collapse, but through selective attention. Joseph Larrows did not become a symbol in his lifetime. He did not become one after. He remained what he had always been, a person whose experience revealed the limits of fairness when procedure replaced judgment. The aftermath did not end with celebration. It ended with recognition that remembrance itself is uneven, and that correcting it requires patience equal to that which had once been demanded of him. His story did not change the disaster. It changed the silence that followed,